Hi, this narrated PowerPoint, which I promise is short, is about symbolic speech. So I posted one earlier on another page in our module about pure speech. That's words that are printed or come out of your mouth. Um, but the First Amendment has also come to protect more than just words coming out of your mouth. What we call symbolic speech, or sometimes called speech plus action or expressive behavior, is also largely protected by the First Amendment as well. So if you're a textualist, you might quibble with that because the Constitution says it's speech that's protected and the press that's protected. And so somebody holding up a sign or somebody burning a flag or something like that, a textualist might say, well, that's not really speech. But what the court has said for a long time, is that what's protected is the expression of ideas. If you want a free and open marketplace of ideas where everybody has a right to express their opinions, sometimes the most effective way of getting an idea across is to use a symbol. So some symbols aren't controversial at all, like a pink armband to show your support for breast cancer research probably isn't very controversial. Something like a swastika, much more controversial. The Confederate flag, much more controversial. Some people get very angry and upset over seeing pictures of aborted fetuses at anti-abortion rallies, etc. But that's all what we call symbolic speech. And for the most part, and I'll talk about just a couple of exceptions that sort of prove the rule, your right to symbolic speech is pretty heavily protected in the Constitution as well. Next week, we're going to talk about what are called time, place, and manner restrictions. So you might have a right to speak out against homelessness, for example, but you might not have the right to speak out against homelessness at 3 o'clock in the morning in a residential neighborhood, right? So we'll talk about that next week, but I wanted to sort of lay the groundwork this week for explaining how the Supreme Court has addressed questions of speech without words, and that's what we call symbolic speech. So for the most part, symbolic speech is pretty highly protected, and the standard that the court set for the government to meet when it wants to infringe on somebody's right to symbolic speech or punish somebody for an act of symbolic speech was set in a case called O'Brien, U.S. versus O'Brien in 1968. Again, this is a lot of the cases having to do with civil rights and civil liberties come out during the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s into the 70s, and also into protests against the Vietnam War. So that's why you see a lot of cases coming before the court in the 1960s. It was a time of a lot of political and social turmoil and unrest. And of course, when people do things that provoke fear in others, or sometimes that the government doesn't like, then sometimes the government tries to punish people, and then cases come before the court. And that's why we get a lot of cases coming during the 1960s come before the court. And for the most part, this test that came out of U.S. versus O'Brien puts a pretty high standard for the government to meet in order to be able to punish somebody or ban or prohibit certain kinds of symbolic speech. So this case came out, again, it was opposition to the Vietnam War. David O'Brien was an anti-war protester who chose to express his opposition to the war, not just by saying, hey, I oppose the war, or down with the draft, or get out of Vietnam. He chose to express his opinion about the Vietnam War by burning his draft card. So during the Vietnam War, the United States had a draft, and young men were given a number and a card that they had to keep that was issued to them by the government, and there was a kind of a lottery for who got called up to be drafted, and the government prohibited the destruction of the draft card because they said it would interfere with the ability of the government to um, do the draft. And so David O'Brien was arrested and he was convicted for interfering with the war effort. And when the case came before the Supreme Court, O'Brien argued that the government was simply punishing him because they didn't like the message that he was conveying by burning his draft card. The government argued that there were lots of ways that David O'Brien could have expressed his opposition to the war. This was the only one that the government felt it had a right to punish because it was something that would interfere with the ability to conduct the war, whether David O'Brien agreed with it or not. So in this case, the court sided with the US government. O'Brien lost, but the test that was established in O'Brien really means that almost everybody else wins, with some exceptions. So here's what the court said. Basically, what the court said is when the government wants to punish somebody's symbolic speech and they want to pass a law or establish a policy that would infringe on somebody's right to symbolically express their opinions about things, the court said the government can only do that if it passes this test, if it meets these criterion. The first thing is the law within the government's power to enact? In other words, is this the sort of law that the government has the power to enact? So if it's something that is a power of Congress, or if it's something that's given to a state government in the state government's constitution, is it the kind of thing that the government has the authority to pass legislation about? That's probably the easiest part of the O'Brien test for the government to meet. In this case, the question was, does the government have the authority to enact policies that are designed to ensure an efficient draft? And certainly that would be within the government's power. In fact, Article 1 of the Constitution specifically gives Congress the power to raise an army. The second question, and this becomes a really, really, really important concept in constitutional law in this issue area. And the second question in the O'Brien test is the policy content neutral? This notion of content neutrality is super, super important. Essentially, what the court has said many, many, many times, and certainly in O'Brien, is that when the government enacts a policy and punishes somebody for, say, for their symbolic speech, in this case, burning the draft card, the government's not allowed to do that if a policy is specifically directed toward one side of an issue. The policy has to be neutral with regard to the content of the speech. So for example, if the law said you can't burn the draft card in opposition to the war, but hey, we'll let you burn the draft card in support of the war. Don't know why anybody would do that, but let's just say that they would. That wouldn't be content neutral. Or if the city of Sacramento, for example, was handing out permits for people to protest on a city street or in a park, and they wanted to have amplified noise and stuff, so they had to have a permit for using the park, then the policy has to be neutral with regard to who's using the park. So they couldn't say groups that support the city of Sacramento's policies will be given a permit, but groups that want to protest a city of Sacramento policy would not be given a permit. So the policy has to be neutral with regard to the content. And what you'll see is that a lot of the cases that come before the court, this is where they fall, because the intent of the policy is really to punish only one point of view. It's viewpoint discrimination. And the court says, we don't really let the government do that. So it has to be content neutral. The third part of the O'Brien test is, does the policy serve a substantial government purpose? The right of free speech is a really important right. It's a fundamental liberty. And we don't really want the government to infringe on that right for trivial reasons. It would just make things easier for the government, or it would speed up the bureaucratic process or something like that. It's like, the policy has to serve a substantial government purpose. It can't just be sort of an unimportant thing that the government wants to do. In this case, of course, it was conducting a draft. And so the court said it certainly serves a substantial government purpose. And then the last thing that the court asks in the O'Brien test is, has the government used the least restrictive means to achieve its end? This least restrictive means test is also really important in evaluating the law in this area. It's possible that the government has to infringe on a right in order to achieve an important government goal. That it just can't be done unless the policy itself is going to have an infringement on a right. And so what the court asks is, are you infringing on people's rights as little as possible? Are you doing as little as possible to still get your goal? And so where David O'Brien lost is the court said, David O'Brien, the government policy restricted only one means of symbolic expression, and that was actually destroying the physical draft card. David O'Brien had a wealth of other options available to express his dissatisfaction with the war. He could have burned a copy of his draft card. He could have burned a copy of the Constitution. He could have embroidered "Dodge the draft" on a t-shirt or something like that. The only thing he was told, you're going to get punished if you do this, is burning the actual draft card, which was essentially government property. And so the O'Brien test itself places a lot of burden on the government to demonstrate that what it's doing is a legitimate infringement on somebody's symbolic speech right. So O'Brien lost. But as it's been applied post-O'Brien, and the court still uses the O'Brien test, has been mostly a victory for symbolic speech. And I just give you a few examples of some of the landmark symbolic speech cases that have come before the court. I promised that this would be a really short PowerPoint. So probably the most famous symbolic speech case in a lot of ways is a case called Tinker versus Des Moines. And this picture over here on the top left of the girl and the boy with the black armbands with the peace signs on them are Mary Beth Tinker and her brother. She was an 8th grader in Des Moines, and she and her brother were pacifists. Their family, in fact, were pacifists, and they were in opposition to the war. And they wore black armbands to school to show opposition to the war, but support for searching for those who were missing in action and showing support for those who had been lost in the Vietnam War. And the principal of their school told them that they had a policy in place against students wearing garb that, like an armband, that would be in opposition to the war. And the principal basically told them, we ought to be supporting the government's position, not opposing the government's position, and said that if the kids came back the next day with their armbands, he would suspend them from school. So of course they did come back, and they got suspended, and the case, the parents sued on behalf of their children, and the case made it to the Supreme Court. And in 1969, the Supreme Court sided with Mary Beth Tinker, this young girl, and her brother. And very famously, the court said, children do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. And in applying O'Brien, the court said this policy that the school had was not content neutral. It only punished people who were in opposition to the war. And the other thing that the court said is, what Tinker versus Des Moines does is it sort of sets a standard. It's like, if you're engaging in symbolic speech, you're not bothering anybody else, and you're not causing a ruckus, and you're not causing a disturbance, you're just quietly expressing your opinion symbolically, that speech is protected. Mary Beth Tinker and her brother didn't cause a riot at school. They didn't cause any trouble at school. Nothing bad happened during the school day. They just wore their armbands, and then everybody did whatever they did at school. They did their math class or whatever. So Tinker versus Des Moines provides constitutional protection for sort of passive symbolic speech. So wearing a pin or a button or something like that. But sometimes people do things that are offensive, that do cause a ruckus. And the question is, can the government punish people for, quote unquote, disturbing the peace when somebody objects to another person's symbolic speech? And in 1971, in a case called Cohen versus California, the Supreme Court said no. So Cohen was opposed to the Vietnam War, and he wore his opinion on his jacket. He had emblazoned, embroidered on his jacket the words "fuck the draft," and he could walk around town with that jacket, right? You have a right to wear whatever clothing you want to wear as an adult, walking through the streets. But what he didn't realize is that he was going to get in trouble if he wore that jacket into a courthouse. And so he did. He wore it into a courthouse, and it caused a disturbance. People were offended by the language. He probably got called no good hippie or whatever they were calling people back in the 1960s and 70s. And he was arrested for disturbing the peace. And his argument was he didn't disturb the peace. He wore a perfectly legal jacket into a place where somebody had a negative reaction. Somebody was offended by his symbolic speech, and he got punished for it. And when this case came before the court in 1971, the court sided with Cohen. They said, people don't have a right not to be offended. You don't have a right to demand that the government shield your eyes from anything that you might not want to see. So if you don't like the aborted fetus pictures, don't look, right? If somebody has bad language on their t-shirt or has a tattoo that you don't like, well, you can be offended, but you don't have this case illustrates that you don't have a right to demand that the government punish somebody for doing something that offends you. And that was the case in Cohen versus California. And then in 1989, the sort of granddaddy of all symbolic speech issues came before the court in this case called Texas versus Johnson, which involved a United States citizen burning the American flag as a method of protest. You can imagine people find this probably one of the most offensive to Americans form of symbolic speech that you could think of. The state of Texas had enacted a law that said it was a crime under Texas law to desecrate, to show disrespect for, and destroy out of anger or disrespect for the government, the flag of Texas or the flag of the United States. And so Gregory Johnson did not like Ronald Reagan's policies, and so he went to a protest, and at that protest he burned an American flag, and he was arrested and convicted under this Texas law. And in 1989 the Supreme Court sided with Johnson, and they struck that Texas law down. One, it wasn't content neutral, right? Under O'Brien, the law has to be content neutral, and what the court found was that the state of Texas only punished people who burned the flag in a disparaging way. It is the proper way to dispose of a torn and tattered flag, to show respect for it, is to burn it. And what the court said is that the state doesn't have the authority to regulate behavior because it doesn't like the message that's being sent. So these cases sort of taken together kind of illustrate the seriousness with which the court takes symbolic speech and the lengths to which the court will go to ensure that symbolic speech rights are protected. I'll give you a couple of examples of exceptions to the rule that seem a little bit out of step with how the court has generally ruled, but just to kind of round out this conversation. In 2003, a case came before the Supreme Court called Virginia versus Black, and it involved two different cross burnings, right? So flag burning is one thing. Burning a cross sends a very different message. It's generally a symbol of the Ku Klux Klan. It's a symbol of white supremacy. It's a tactic that was used to sow fear and keep Black people afraid and subservient uh, from probably before the Civil War, but certainly after the Civil War. And there's very little symbolic expression that is more terrifying than a burning cross for especially for Black Americans in the United States. And so in Virginia versus Black, Virginia had a law on the books that basically defined any burning of a cross as a hate crime and provided for penalties, hate crime penalties for any incidents of burning a cross. And there were two groups of people who got arrested. One was this guy Black, who was a Ku Klux Klan leader, who burned a cross as part of a Klan rally with the property owner's permission. But it was a really tall cross, and you could see it. This African American couple driving on the highway saw this cross burning. It was this really big cross on these people's property. The second incidence of cross burning was a group of teenagers who were retaliating against their Black neighbor who had called the police because they were shooting their guns in their backyard, and you're not supposed to shoot guns in residential areas. And so they got in trouble, and then they got really drunk, and they tried to light a cross on the property, the Black family's lawn. And so both groups were arrested and charged with these hate crimes. And in 2003, the Supreme Court struck down the conviction of the Ku Klux Klan leader. They said that might be hate. It certainly is hate speech, but it is also political speech. And because it is political speech, it is protected under the First Amendment. But they said, normally we would protect the symbolic rights, the symbolic speech rights of people who want to wear a swastika or want to fly the Confederate flag or something like that. But cross burning, when it is directed at an individual person or an individual family, that has such a long history of terror in the United States that, you know what, we're going to allow that punishment to go forward. They said just cross burnings. That's where we are carving out a little bit of an exception to the generally protected symbolic speech. So they could have been, they certainly were guilty of trespass and of vandalism of these people's property. But the hate crime enhancement, the court said, we're going to let that one stand. And so what they basically said is a state doesn't have to provide an enhanced penalty for cross burning, but we will not find it to be a violation of the First Amendment if they do. And then the other case that I would bring to your attention is this case called Morris versus Frederick. It's often called the Bong Hits for Jesus case. So this involved a group of high school kids in Alaska who were let out of school early so they could attend the torch run, the Olympic torch run that was going through their community. It's kind of a big deal, and so the school let them out. And the kids thought that it would be really funny because the press was going to be there and it was going to be shown on the media. So they made this sign and they held it up during, when the media was there, and it said "Bong Hits for Jesus." The idea being that, Jesus would have smoked pot, and they thought it was really funny. Well, they got in trouble at school, and I think they even weren't allowed to go to their graduation ceremony or something. They got suspended, or there was a consequence for doing that. And when this case was going before the Supreme Court, a lot of people thought, well, this is a no-brainer. This is symbolic speech. They were goofing off. And the fact that the school didn't like the message, the fact that it embarrassed the school, they weren't on school property. It wasn't an official school activity, where the court has said schools have a lot more authority over kids during official school activities. A lot of people thought the court was going to strike this penalty, this punishment down, but they didn't. They sided with the school. And this is one of those instances where the court kind of carved out a little exception. They said, you know, schools are an important place where kids are taught not necessarily right from wrong, but the school has an interest in sort of keeping kids safe. And one of the messages that the school might want to promote is an anti-drug message. And so they said, because the school has an interest in promoting abstinence from drugs, they were within their rights, because they had let the kids out of school, even though it wasn't a school activity, they were still within sort of the purview of the school, and that the school could punish them for something that they did, they went to with the school's blessing, and violated the school's anti-drug policy. It's going to be interesting to see over time if schools sort of push the boundaries of that. A lot of people have, it's an ongoing debate. How far does a school's authority over children extend? So, for example, could a school impose a penalty on kids who bully another kid over social media, and argue that that's an important way of making sure kids get a good education? That's a question that the court has not answered, but at some point you can imagine some sort of case coming before the court like that. So the O'Brien test, super, super important. And these cases are just sort of examples of the kinds of symbolic speech that people have gotten in trouble for, and that the court has, for the most part, protected over time. That's that.